Today, like many, I woke to the horrible, heartbreaking news that Mr. Charlie Kirk was shot dead in a brutal, unprovoked, cold-blooded murder on a university campus, of all places for this to occur. Charlie was a husband, a father, and one of the internet's most famous contrarian orators, and he was a freedom of speech absolutist. Sadly, it is this freedom, the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression, the same freedom that underpins American liberty, the foundation of the state, that using this freedom sadly cost Charlie his life. Based on what I know and what I've observed of Charlie, the idea that he might fall while defending and using his freedom of speech at a university, the very place where it should be most secure, reads as bitter irony. Utah's governor, he described the point-blank shooting from a rooftop as political assassination. This underscores the gravity of the attack on free expression. The fact that Charlie was silenced in an academic setting underscores a tragic collapse of the tolerant discourse that universities are meant to uphold. Charlie was a spokesman for many young people, for millions of young people who have been demoralised, not just by the left, but by culture wars in America and throughout the world. Yes, he was pro-Trump. He was Make America Great Again. He often questioned America's continued involvement in Ukraine. He, until recently, was an adamant supporter of Israel. But after huge backlash, he started asking more difficult questions. None of this is ever justifiable by what we saw occur on the university campus. Charlie often swam against the current of mainstream narratives. Whether one agreed with him or not, he stood firmly for the right to voice dissenting opinions. And ultimately, he gave his life for this. Now, I don't know Charlie personally, and I often vehemently disagreed with many of his positions. But this is part of a working democracy. I didn't see Charlie as a radical or that he was radicalising anyone. He was openly inviting opposing views. And that is exactly what he was doing on the day he lost his life. By engaging adversaries in dialogue, he upheld the classic liberal idea that the remedy for disagreeable speech is more speech, not suppression. And no matter how much I disagreed with him on some things, I highly respected that. Our society desperately needs voices that challenge us without being demonised as evil. Voices we can argue against, passionately, but peacefully. As Nietzsche famously observed, he who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. We must be careful not to become the monsters we claim to oppose. In a democracy, political opponents are not mortal enemies. They are fellow citizens with different ideas. On the other hand, the radicalising and now the successfully radicalised are on display for the world to see. And it is terrifying. Go and look at the vile comments in the comment sections below Charlie Kirk's death, or the complete lack of coverage for the cold-blooded murder of Irina Zarutska. And this has shined the light on cultural double standards. Look at how cities burnt and state-funded funerals across America for a career criminal. A fentanyl addict with a rap sheet as long as my arm, dying from an overdose, or even at worst, dying from an accident. But look at the double standard there. Compare this to the absolute lack of outrage over a young woman on a train dying terrified alone because she didn't fit the narrative. No one in the mainstream media is talking about it. that outrage, compassion and empathy, that these are selective. Again, as Nietzsche says, in individuals, insanity is rare, but in groups, parties, nations and epochs, it is the rule. This discrepancy is not about defending one victim over another. It's about consistency. Murder is murder. Yet the media's disproportionate responses skew the public's moral compass. When a narrative of racial or ideological victimhood can then be advanced by the media. The media has blood on its hands. The media, by shaping pseudo-environments, artificially creating narratives of reality that play to the emotions and ideology rather than fact, where subjectivity and perpetual victimhood is the truth and objective experienced reality is seen as a fringe extremist idea. I'll say that again, where subjectivity and perpetual victimhood is the truth and objective experienced reality is seen as a fringe extremist idea. Today, we see how millions in the public have been successfully radicalised, all in the name of saving these dying media channels to gain some clicks. Again, as Nietzsche says, all things are subject to interpretation. Whichever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power and not truth. And Mr. Charlie Kirk, one of my favourite quotes of him saying, "When you deliberately distort and selectively present the truth, you lie." What are the consequences for elevating subjective truth over objective facts? It breeds a pernicious form of moral and cultural relativism. The media and bloggers have parasitically infected our institutions like schooling, from grade 1 through to tertiary, to believe a narrative where objectivity is placed below the relativisation of truth. This is where we see the term my truth, your truth, our truth, and not the term the truth. And this breeds a form of moral and cultural relativism. Since truth depends on perspective, judging one's claim as objectively false becomes difficult or taboo or extreme. And a few examples to illustrate this trend is experience over evidence. Personal feelings and anecdotes now carry more weight than hard data or traditional expertise. If someone feels oppressed or unsafe, they feel oppressed or unsafe, that feeling is treated as truth, even if statistics or evidence contradict it. Objective studies are readily dismissed whenever they conflict with how a favoured group experiences reality. In this climate, emotion trumps evidence, and policy debates devolve into battles of personal narratives rather than reasoned analysis. We have the deconstruction of traditions. There is a fashionable impulse to question or tear down all traditional norms and knowledge, under the belief that these are merely constructs of historically dominant powers. In academia, many argue that truth itself is just a social construct. It's a narrative spun by those in power to justify their privilege. As a result, long-held principle, scientific method, meritocracy, or even the idea of biological sex are devalued or labelled as oppressive myths. Everything becomes fluid and negotiable, except the new dogma that nothing is truly knowable. We go further for the empathy of wrongdoers, and we see this from Australia to America to everywhere. The empathy for wrongdoers. In this age of subjectivity, even crime and punishment get redefined. The perpetrators of heinous acts are frequently recast as victims of social injustice. A violent criminal is not viewed purely as an individual who chose to do wrong, but rather as someone pushed into it by the system, by poverty, by racism, trauma. the emphasis shifts from moral accountability to therapeutic understanding. We see a young girl murdered on a train, but all people want to do is talk about then this empathy and injustice rather than what actually happened to this young woman. We hear that society is to blame, not the criminal. Calls for reform and rehabilitation, they drown out the calls for justice. Of course, addressing root causes is important, so we do still need to address root causes and trace back. But taken too far, which is what we're doing everywhere, the mindset erodes the basic notion of any personal responsibility or accountability. Under a strongly subjectivist view, where even evil itself is relativised, that one man's terrorist becomes another man's freedom fighter, and condemning any act outright becomes taboo because we don't know their truth, rather than simply murder is murder. We often point on this channel to the inequality of compassion and the hierarchy of human suffering world leaders have when we look at the wars taking place currently. But you can look at that domestically as well. The inequality of compassion and the hierarchy of human suffering. In this worldview, objective reality is fringe or even suspect. Meanwhile, perpetual victimhood is elevated as the highest truth. Is it any wonder then that so many people, especially on university campuses, feel justified in silencing, deplatforming, or even physically attacking or assassinating those they deem oppressors? If you are convinced your perspective is the only valid truth, and that anyone who challenges it is not just wrong, but that they are evil, then almost any means of shutting them up can be internally rationalised. I remember when President Trump was shot, I posted online that regardless of what you think of Trump, that this is not acceptable in a democracy. And many of the replies I got compared the situation to Hitler or Stalin or Mao, with people asking me, Willie, if you had the chance to shoot one of these leaders, would you not? Now, firstly, let's put aside the complexity of decapitation strikes against leaders. Leaders embody the system, but they do not exist apart from it. Remove one, and the system often produces a replacement who is just as radical, if not more so. But let's take it at face value. This idea that Trump is Hitler, and would you not have taken out Hitler if you were given the choice? Take this at face value. What I took away from this is that the media, bloggers, opposing political systems, has led millions to believe, wholeheartedly, with relativism, to believe that Trump is Hitler, and someone like Charlie was a Goebbels-style propagandist. Now, has this watered down the atrocities of these historical figures? Or has it purposely created an environment by proxy where these contemporary figures take on the extremes of the historical ones? And I believe the latter, that it's created this environment where these new age figures, these contemporary figures, take on the guilt and the extreme of the historical ones, even if that is not true. And what struck me about all of this is how thoroughly Americans or Australians have been indoctrinated by the media rhetoric that they earnestly view these contemporary figures as literal reincarnations of these genocidal dictators. My argument at the time was that these average people have been told that Trump is the new rising of Hitler, and that if you truly believe that, it is completely reasonable to want to see the death of Hitler or an analogue of Hitler. But of course, anyone who has had their eyes open and their brain thinking critically, knows this to be a ridiculous comparison. But the relativization of truth, if you sincerely believe that a new Hitler or Goebbels has come into the fold, wouldn't you shoot him if you could to save humanity? And this is that relativization that we have seen and the indoctrination of millions. And that scared me at the time, and I'm seeing it again. Seeking to legitimise brutality in the name of preventing the next Holocaust, even though nothing of the sort was actually on the horizon. But that pseudo-environment had been fabricated by the media, by bloggers, by political parties. So who shot Charlie? Well, much like the Trump shooter or JFK, we will likely never know the full truth. Was it a radicalised student? A radicalised member of society? It could be far left, it could be far right. As ideologies of far left and far right, this is not on a flat spectrum. This is on a horseshoe. The horseshoe comes around of the far right and the far left, and the far right and far left are far closer to each other than they are to moderates. Nazis and Antifa are unbelievably close, and the jump between is much smaller than going all the way back around. As Jung says, the pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong. We've entered a new era where political violence is increasingly seen as a feature, not a bug of America. Could it, against Mr. Kirk, be a state-level hit? A lot of people seem to think so. American-Ukrainian spokesman Sarah Ashton-Cirillo stated, Russia's war criminal propagandists will all be hunted down and justice will be served. We also saw a targeted attack on philosopher Alexander Dugin that sadly killed his daughter Daria. There's unfounded rumours too that Charlie had made comments regarding Israel and having some fear there too. And what we know is Israel is not shy to remove people that they have deemed as state-level enemies. Could it be a false flag event? A third party orchestrating the assassination to pin blame on a convenient culprit and sway public sentiment? In a time where conspiracy theories proliferate, some will certainly seize on this idea. Was Charlie's murder intended to martyr him and galvanise support for his causes, or conversely, to make his side look like the victims and thus engineer a crackdown on the other side? The sober truth is, so far we don't know who pulled the trigger. Maybe we will know who pulled the trigger, but there will always be questions about why. Much like the Trump shooter, we never got a real background. Where does America go from here? America needs an honest conversation with itself and to look in the mirror. America is the land of extremes. I've spent many, many months in America, and there's parts I absolutely love and there's parts I absolutely hate. But America is the land of extreme. And it's these extremes that breed the brilliance and tragedy of America. Now, Australia doesn't have this extreme pendulum swing that we see in the US. But this is also why we are not on the cutting edge of ideas, of entrepreneurship, of technology, of political discussion. But it's also the reason why we don't have all the mass shootings. We have far less extreme mental health, public safety nets, health, all of this too. So I believe in the land of extreme, you're going to have both. And if you don't have that extreme one way, you're not going to have the extreme the other. And it's often said, America's greatness lies in its ability to err and self-correct. I feel in a way, America is dominant due to the wild nature and the unbelievable competition of free trade financial markets and the free trade markets of thoughts and ideas. But the pressure is coming upon all of these. When we see horrible acts like this, I ask, is this the system or is it a byproduct of the system? Now, there are two trains of thought about the death of democracy. Does it go out with a bang or a whimper? America is absolutely at a turning point. Americans, whether left, centre, right, or in the extremes, Americans are not happy. America has extended into every part of the globe, with more nations turning their backs than ones welcoming them with open arms. Let alone the polarisation of internal politics, the polarisation of truth, relativism, and objectivity and religion, the mountain of unpayable debt. Let alone China rising, looking to overtake America in short term. Will America live on? Yes, but it needs a serious look inwards. And it needs to rely on its traditions and its foundations that have got it to the position it is in today. America can still save itself by reclaiming a commitment to objective truth and principled disagreement. We must demand better of our media, hold them accountable for honest, truthful reporting and when they over-sensationalise. We must demand better of our schools and universities, insisting that they teach students how to think, not what to think, and expose them to diverse viewpoints, and make this actually a learning environment of how to think, not just the accepted orthodoxy. The media must stop feeding us a steady diet of fear, hate, and mistruths just for clicks. But we as the public, we are accountable and we are responsible too. We must stop consuming it so uncritically, unquestionably taking this in. It's a tragedy what has happened. And as I've said, this is going to get worse before it gets better. I'll leave you with a quote that Charlie Kirk said. If you believe in something, you need to have the courage to fight for those ideas, not run away from them and try and silence them. It's a horrible tragedy, what has happened to Charlie. But what has happened is a reflection of the breakdown of truth, the breakdown of systems, and this parasitic relativism seeping into everything. Legends. Thank you for listening to me. Have a fantastic day. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.